Welcome back to the Alibi Club, where every mystery is a file waiting to be reopened. They say legends are born in smoke and thunder, but some are born in silence, with nothing more than a ticket, a bourbon, and a quiet smile. One man boarded a plane, made his demands, and then vanished into the night sky. No body, no trail, just an empty seat and a storm. His name? D.B. Cooper. And to this day, no one knows if he lived, died, or laughed as the rain swallowed him whole. Once aboard Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, he ordered a bourbon and soda and lit a cigarette. Moments later, he slipped a note to a flight attendant, calmly declaring he had a bomb. His demands were chillingly simple: $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and a refueling plan. They gave him everything. At 8:13 p.m., somewhere over the forests of Washington in freezing rain, he lowered the rear stairwell of the Boeing 727 and leapt into the darkness, vanishing forever. Here at the Alibi Club, every case file we reopen drips with mystery, but none quite like this one. On November 24, 1971, a man calling himself Dan Cooper walked into Portland International Airport. He was ordinary in every sense, mid-40s, dressed like a businessman in a dark suit, tie, and polished shoes. He carried a single briefcase, bought a one-way ticket to Seattle for $20, and blended into the crowd without raising suspicion. Nothing about him suggested that, within hours, he would trigger one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. The FBI launched the largest manhunt in its history. Decades passed, theories multiplied, and still, the mystery remains unsolved. Tonight, we reopen the file on the mystery of D.B. Cooper, the man who jumped into thin air. It was November of 1971. The Vietnam War had dragged on for years, draining faith in government and leaving the American public restless, skeptical, and deeply divided. Protests rattled cities. A growing sense of distrust in authority filled coffee shops and newspaper headlines. At the same time, the golden age of air travel was still in full swing. Flying was elegant, even stylish, a privilege for businessmen and families who wanted to taste modernity. Airlines marketed comfort, not caution. Flight attendants were trained to smile, not scan for danger. Boarding a plane was as easy as walking into a bus terminal. You bought your ticket, paid in cash if you liked, and no one asked for identification. There were no TSA checkpoints, no X-rays, no body scanners. The skies were wide open. Here at the Alibi Club, every mystery has a setting, a stage upon which the story unfolds. To understand the case of D.B. Cooper, we need to step back into America in the early 1970s, a time when the world felt like it was unraveling, and the skies above were both glamorous and terrifyingly unguarded. And with that openness came a strange phenomenon: airplane hijackings. Between 1968 and 1972, more than 100 commercial flights in the United States were hijacked. Some were desperate passengers demanding to be flown to Cuba. Others were criminals looking for ransom. Many ended in chaos, some in blood, but most were clumsy, reckless attempts. Few had style, fewer still had mystery. Then came the man who called himself Dan Cooper. Cooper was described as a middle-aged white male, around 6 feet tall, wearing a dark suit, white shirt, black tie, and polished shoes. His hair was neatly combed, his manner polite, his voice low and calm. Witnesses said he could have been any businessman on his way to a meeting in Seattle. He blended in effortlessly with the crowd. That was part of his power, his ordinariness. He was forgettable, right up until the moment he made himself unforgettable. But here's the curious detail. The name he gave, Dan Cooper, wasn't random. There existed a French-Canadian comic book in the 1950s and 60s about a heroic Royal Canadian Air Force test pilot named Dan Cooper. The character parachuted into danger, executed daring missions, and always came out alive. Was our hijacker a fan of the series? Was it a private joke, a wink at the world he planned to outwit? Or was it coincidence? Nobody knows. But the name choice feels deliberate, as if Cooper wanted to sign his legend before he even began writing it. But the backdrop to his crime is as important as the man himself. The Boeing 727 was a relatively new plane at the time, with a feature that would prove central to Cooper's plan: an air stair that could be lowered mid-flight. It was designed to let passengers disembark directly onto the runway without a jet bridge. But in Cooper's hands, it became his escape hatch, the door to legend. He knew about it. He planned for it. He used it. The real man remains faceless. Was he military trained? A veteran of Korea or Vietnam with knowledge of parachutes and aircraft? Was he a disgruntled worker seeking revenge on the system? Or was he simply a man with nerves of steel and nothing left to lose? The FBI assembled profiles, interviewed suspects, and tried to dig into every possible lead. They never found one that stuck. Northwest Orient Airlines, the company targeted, was no small carrier. It was one of the giants of the skies, serving routes across the United States and Asia. Its flight crews were seasoned, its systems well run. But on November 24, 1971, Cooper found a way to exploit the gap between sophistication and security. Thanksgiving Eve was one of the busiest travel days of the year. Airports bustled with families heading home, businessmen squeezing in one last trip before the holiday. Flight 305 was a short hop, Portland to Seattle, just 30 minutes in the air, a commuter run, a forgettable journey. 36 passengers boarded, along with 6 crew members. None could have imagined that their flight would be hijacked into legend. The ransom demand, $200,000, wasn't chosen at random either. Adjusted for inflation, it's the equivalent of more than $1 million today. Not a fortune by modern criminal standards, but in 1971, it was enough to set someone up for life if they knew how to disappear. The 4 parachutes Cooper requested also hinted at his cleverness. By demanding more than one, he created uncertainty. Were they for him alone, or for him and a hostage? If law enforcement tried to tamper with them, they risked killing an innocent passenger. It was psychological chess, played calmly, one move at a time. The FBI would later confirm that Cooper seemed knowledgeable about aviation. He knew the 727's unique features. He specified that the plane fly at 10,000 feet with the landing gear down and flaps at 15 degrees settings that allowed for a slower, safer jump. He refused a military parachute, insisting on civilian ones, perhaps to suggest inexperience, or perhaps to hide his own training. Each demand seemed precise, calculated, and carried out without panic. Yet, for all the planning, for all the calm, his identity remained smoke. Some witnesses suggested a slight accent, perhaps Canadian. Others noticed his hands were not rough, but not delicate either. He smoked constantly, Raleigh filter tips, a brand that left ashes and butts behind, but no usable prints. He drank bourbon and soda, and never appeared nervous, not even when slipping a note to a flight attendant that claimed he held a bomb. The note itself is gone, lost by investigators who thought they'd catch him within days. The sketches of his face, the famous Cooper composite, show a man with a sharp jaw, dark hair, sunglasses, and a cool expression. That face has stared back at us from wanted posters and documentaries for half a century, but it's still just an artist's guess at the truth. And so the background of the Cooper case is a paradox. We know much, and we know nothing. We know his clothes, his drink, his cigarettes, his words. We know his plan, his demands, his leap into the storm. But we don't know his name, his past, or his fate. He is the most famous unknown man in American crime. This is the stage upon which the night of the hijacking will unfold. A restless country, an unsecured sky, a man who walked into an airport as a stranger, and walked out of history as a legend. And with that, the case file begins in earnest. Here at the Alibi Club, we dim the light and turn the page. Next comes the night itself, the moment when ordinary air travel turned into one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in the world. The evening of November 24th, 1971, began as nothing more than a short commuter hop. Flight 305 was scheduled to take just half an hour from Portland to Seattle, a routine trip, the kind of flight most passengers forgot about the moment they landed. But this night would etch itself into history. A man in his mid-40s, dressed in a business suit, white shirt and black tie, boarded the Boeing 727 with the air of someone on his way to an ordinary appointment. He carried only a briefcase, wore sunglasses, despite the dim northwest light, and gave his name simply as Dan Cooper. His demeanor was calm, his movements measured. He bought his ticket with cash, $20 for a one-way trip. No identification was required in those days. To the gate agents and crew, he looked like just another businessman on a holiday flight. At 2:50 p.m., the plane lifted off, carrying 36 passengers and 6 crew members. The weather was already shifting, clouds thickening, rain threatening, the kind of night where the world beyond the cabin windows seemed to fade into a curtain of grey. Nothing about the takeoff hinted at the storm to come, at least not the kind of storm anyone could predict. A few minutes after takeoff, a flight attendant, Florence Schaffner, walked past row 18, where Cooper was seated. He slipped her a note. At first she assumed it was another tired attempt at flirting, a phone number perhaps, or some invitation. She tucked it into her pocket without opening it. Cooper leaned toward her and spoke in a quiet, level tone that froze her in place. "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." The words carried no panic, no drama, just simple, chilling certainty. Schaffner opened the note and saw neat, deliberate handwriting. Cooper demanded that she sit beside him. When she did, he cracked open his briefcase, just enough to reveal a set of red cylinders wired to a battery. Real or fake, it didn't matter. The sight was convincing enough. Schaffner realized she was staring at the centerpiece of a hijacking in progress. Cooper outlined his demands. $200,000 in American currency, 4 parachutes, 2 main and 2 reserve, and a fuel truck ready to meet the plane in Seattle. His voice remained steady. He didn't shout, didn't make sudden movements. He was polite, even courteous, as though he were negotiating a business deal rather than holding lives in his hands. The cockpit was informed. Captain William Scott, First Officer William Ratigzak, and Flight Engineer Harold Anderson quickly relayed the situation to air traffic control. The FBI was notified, and plans were set in motion. Cooper instructed that the passengers be told nothing beyond a minor mechanical delay. The crew complied. Drinks were served. The cabin remained calm. Passengers would later recall sensing little more than impatience about the delay, unaware that a man a few rows back was quietly rewriting aviation history. As the plane circled to buy time, law enforcement scrambled in Seattle. Agents rushed to gather the ransom money, $200,000 in $20 bills, pulled from local banks. Each bill's serial number was recorded, a trap for the future. Meanwhile, 4 parachutes were secured from a local skydiving school. By 5:24 p.m., the items were delivered to the airport, ready to be exchanged for the release of the passengers. The landing in Seattle was tense. Floodlights illuminated the rain-slick runway as the 727 rolled to a stop. FBI agents, Northwest Orient executives, and local police watched from a distance. Cooper's instructions were precise. He wanted the money and parachutes brought to the plane personally. He would not accept substitutions. When the items were finally handed over, he released the 36 passengers. They walked off the plane into the cold night air, dazed but safe, still largely unaware of how close they had come to disaster. Only the crew remained. The crew protested that a direct flight to Mexico City wasn't possible on the available fuel. Cooper agreed to a refueling stop in Reno, Nevada. The negotiations were calm, almost eerie in their professionalism. Cooper never raised his voice. He chain-smoked Raleigh cigarettes, sipped bourbon, and kept his sunglasses on in the dim cabin light. Flight attendants later described him as strangely polite, even considerate, never cruel. He offered one of them a ransom pack to keep as a souvenir, though she declined. He tipped well in words, if not in cash. Now came the second phase of his plan. Cooper instructed the pilots to chart a course south, toward Mexico City, but his orders were unusual. Fly no higher than 10,000 feet, keep the landing gear deployed, set the flaps to 15 degrees, and keep the cabin unpressurized. These were not random demands. At such low altitude and speed, the aircraft could remain stable for a parachute jump. The Boeing 727 was one of the few planes with a rear air stair that could be lowered mid-flight, an obscure feature Cooper seemed to know about in detail. At 8:13 p.m., something happened. A sudden pressure change registered in the cockpit, the telltale sign of the rear stairway being lowered. The crew couldn't see what was happening, but they knew. Cooper was making his move. At 7:40 p.m., the plane took off again, now carrying only the crew and the hijacker. It was raining, the night sky thick with clouds, winds cutting across the route. Military aircraft scrambled to shadow the 727 at a distance, hoping to watch what unfolded. They trailed silently, their eyes on a plane carrying a ghost. In the darkness, in the freezing November rain, he gathered the money, packed into a bank bag, and strapped one of the parachutes to his back. Then, without fanfare, without a word, he stepped into the storm. The slipstream would have been deafening, the wind howling, the cold cutting into his bones. Below him stretched endless miles of forests, rivers, and rugged terrain, shrouded in rain and shadow. Somewhere in that void, D.B. Cooper disappeared. In that moment, a legend was born. The man with no past, no future, and no trace had jumped into thin air, and the world has been chasing his shadow ever since. When the plane landed in Reno hours later, the rear stairway was still down, banging against the tarmac. Cooper was gone. No parachute lay on the runway, no trace of his body or gear. Only the emptiness of row 18 remained, a seat still warm from a man who had just rewritten the definition of a perfect crime. When we think of victims, we often think of bloodshed, of lives ended suddenly, but the night of November 24th, 1971, left no bodies in the aisles, no violence written in blood. And yet there were victims, people who carried fear, trauma, suspicion, and the heavy weight of unanswered questions long after the plane touched down without its hijacker. But the crew, they knew, they lived the tension in real time. On board Flight 305 were 36 passengers, most of them ordinary travelers heading home for Thanksgiving. To this day, their names rarely surface in accounts of the case. They are the forgotten witnesses to a legend. Many of them left the plane that night, unaware of how close they had been to danger. They believed the delay in Seattle was just a routine mechanical issue. Drinks were poured, conversations murmured, and a man in a business suit sat calmly in row 18, holding a storm in his briefcase. Florence Schaffner, the flight attendant who first received Cooper's note, was 23 years old. At an age when most people are only beginning their lives, she was suddenly thrust into the role of negotiator with a man claiming to hold a bomb. She later admitted that Cooper was polite, almost fatherly in tone, but the politeness was edged with dread. Every time she sat beside him, every time she glanced at the briefcase filled with red sticks and wires, she lived in the space between life and death. If the device was real, one wrong move could end not only her life, but the lives of everyone on board. Tina Mucklow, another flight attendant, became Cooper's primary point of contact once the ransom and parachutes were delivered. She described him as calm and courteous, even offering reassurances that nothing bad would happen if everyone cooperated. But reassurance is a thin fabric when stitched by a hijacker. She spent hours in his presence, watching his every move, trapped in the delicate balance between keeping him comfortable and keeping herself alive. Even after the safe release of the passengers, the crew remained trapped with Cooper during the second leg of the flight. They knew the ransom was delivered, knew he had the parachutes, and knew he intended to jump, but they didn't know when. Every flicker of movement, every rustle from the rear of the cabin, might have been the moment when he would detonate the device or leap into the unknown. When the cockpit finally registered the pressure shift, the stairway lowering, it was not relief they felt, but a new kind of terror. He was gone. Yes, but what if the bomb wasn't? What if it remained behind as his last word? The pilots carried their own burden. Captain William Scott, First Officer William Ratigzak, and Flight Engineer Harold Anderson knew the stakes from the moment the note was relayed to the cockpit. They were trained for emergencies, but nothing quite like this. Negotiating altitude, fuel stops, and flight paths with a man threatening to blow the plane from the sky was a kind of psychological torture. Cooper wasn't violent, but his steady voice was more unnerving than shouting. He radiated control, and in those hours, the crew were prisoners in their own aircraft. They landed in Reno with their nerves frayed, their adrenaline burned away, their lives changed. Cooper was gone, but the memory of him stayed etched into their skin. And then there were the investigators, victims in their own way, shackled to a mystery that refused to yield. The FBI assigned more than 40 agents to the case in its opening days, turning the Pacific Northwest upside down in search of a man who had disappeared into the night. Helicopters combed the forests. Divers searched rivers. Military and civilian volunteers scoured mountainsides. Nothing, not a single usable trace. Every failure to find him deepened the psychological wound, until Cooper became less of a suspect and more of a ghost haunting the Bureau's pride. But perhaps the deepest victims were not on the plane at all. They were the families who, in the decades that followed, found themselves entangled in Cooper theories. Brothers, fathers, uncles, ordinary men suddenly pointed to as the real D.B. Cooper. Some were veterans with parachute training, others men with criminal pasts, a few simply loners who fit the description. Their families endured raids, interrogations, suspicion from neighbors. Some watched their loved ones' reputations erode under the weight of speculation, even when the evidence was paper-thin. To be related to a man who might have been Cooper was to inherit a shadow. There's another category of victims too, the passengers who never understood just how close they came to disaster. Many of them disembarked believing only that their flight had been unusually delayed. It wasn't until they watched the evening news or read the papers that they realized they had been part of one of the most infamous hijackings in history. Imagine the retroactive chill of learning that the man a few seats away had held a bomb, demanded a fortune, and vanished into the rain. Some would carry that shock quietly for the rest of their lives, unspoken but unforgettable. And then there's Cooper himself. Is it possible he was also a victim? If he survived the jump, he had to face the brutal cold of a November night in the Pacific Northwest wilderness, carrying a heavy bag of cash, clad in thin city clothes. If he died, his body was claimed by rivers, forests, and mountains, never found despite decades of searching. If he lived, he was condemned to a life in hiding, unable to spend his fortune freely, a man pursued by shadows. Victory that night may have come at the price of peace for the rest of his life. The truth is, the human element of the Cooper case is often overshadowed by the legend. The cool hijacker in sunglasses, the bag of cash, the leap into the night, that's the story people remember. But for those who were there, it wasn't legend. It was fear, confusion, and helplessness. It was trusting that a stranger with a briefcase wouldn't change his mind and kill them all. The file marks this section as the human cost. A crime without gunfire, without a body count, but with scars that lingered. Crew members whose names are footnotes in history, passengers who became unwitting witnesses, families dragged into suspicion, and an FBI haunted by failure. They all share the same quiet wound. They were pulled into the orbit of a man who turned the ordinary into the extraordinary, and then left them all with nothing but questions. In mysteries like this, it's easy to chase the legend and forget the people. But the truth is, D.B. Cooper didn't just disappear into thin air. He left behind a wake of silence, anxiety, and the heavy burden of being part of something unresolved. And with that, the file turns another page. The focus shifts not just to the people but to the strange warnings, whispers, and shadows that appeared before the night even began. The odd clues that suggested the hijacking may have been written in fate before it was ever written in smoke. Start with the most obvious, the choice of date. Thanksgiving Eve was not just another day on the calendar. It was one of the busiest travel days of the year, when airports swelled with hurried passengers, when airlines operated at maximum capacity, and when the noise of family reunions drowned out the details of strangers. For a man planning a hijacking, it was the perfect cover. The crowds provided camouflage. The urgency of holiday schedules provided leverage. Law enforcement would be spread thin, focused on traffic and holiday patrols, not on a single flight out of Portland. The very day itself feels like a clue, a mark of deliberate selection rather than coincidence. Every case has its shadows, and in this one, the shadows seem to stretch back before the jump itself. For decades, investigators and armchair sleuths have scoured the timeline, hunting for fragments of warning signs, odd coincidences, and strange clues that hinted at a larger story. The night of November 24th did not simply appear from nowhere. It carried with it the faint scent of preparation, of whispers and unfinished threads. Then there's the curious matter of the name. Dan Cooper. On its face it was forgettable, ordinary, even. But to those who knew European comics, it rang a bell. The Dan Cooper comic book series, published in Belgium and France, followed the adventures of a Royal Canadian Air Force test pilot. The hero parachuted into hostile skies, tackled dangerous missions, and always survived. Was our hijacker a fan? Did he pluck the name from a dog-eared magazine, chuckling to himself as he bought the ticket? Or was it another layer of misdirection, meant to mock investigators by pointing them toward a fictional character instead of a flesh and blood man? Either way, the alias feels less like chance and more like a signature, a wink carved into the opening act of the drama. And what of the bomb? Investigators never recovered it, if it existed at all. Schaffner and Mucklow swore they saw red sticks wired to a battery, a convincing replica, if it was fake. Was it dynamite? Road flares? Painted wood? To this day nobody knows. The clue existed only in memory, in the haunted testimony of those who sat inches away from it. If it was real, then Cooper had access to dangerous materials. If it was fake, then his confidence in passing off the deception suggests training, practice, and nerve. Either way, the bomb was both a weapon and a mask, and it vanished with him into the night. Another peculiar clue sits in his demands: 4 parachutes, not 1. Why 4? Most hijackers of the era demanded a single parachute for themselves. By asking for 4, 2 primary, and 2 reserve, Cooper introduced psychological uncertainty. Was he planning to take a hostage with him? Would tampering with the equipment risk killing an innocent? This small detail forced law enforcement's hand, ensuring the gear provided was functional. It was strategy, not accident. and it points to someone who understood negotiation as much as he understood parachuting. There were also the cigarettes. Rolly filter tips, chain-smoked one after the other, as Cooper sat in row 18. Cigarette brands may seem trivial, but every detail matters. Rolly cigarettes were part of a promotional program. You could collect coupons from each pack and exchange them for household goods. In theory, those coupons could have been traced, leading back to stores or even a buyer, but no such lead ever materialized. Still, the choice of brand speaks of a man who knew the ordinary, who cloaked himself in the mundane details of everyday life to avoid standing out. There are whispers, too, of earlier hijackings that may have inspired him. Just weeks before Cooper boarded Flight 305, another man attempted a skyjacking with a parachute escape. That attempt failed, but it showed that the concept was possible. Did Cooper study these earlier cases, taking note of their flaws and building a cleaner plan, or was he simply one of many who saw the skies as a loophole waiting to be exploited? The files suggest influence, if not outright imitation. The strange clues extend beyond the night itself, bleeding into the investigation that followed. Consider the tie. Cooper left it behind on his seat, a black clip-on tie, mother-of-pearl tie clip still attached. For decades it seemed like nothing more than a piece of discarded clothing. But years later, modern forensic techniques revealed something odd. Tiny metallic particles embedded in the fabric, the kind associated with titanium and rare industrial processes of the era. Did Cooper work in aerospace? In a factory connected to aircraft manufacturing? If so, the tie may have been the single greatest clue to his background, abandoned carelessly in the rush of escape. And yet, despite this, no clear suspect ever emerged. Another detail often overlooked. Cooper ordered a bourbon and soda while waiting for his demands to be met. He drank it calmly, leaving fingerprints on the glass. Yet none matched any in the FBI's records. Some say the prints were smudged or incomplete. Others claim they were mishandled, lost in the chaos of the investigation. Either way, the drink became another ghost in the file, a clue that dissolved into nothing. Even his demeanor becomes a kind of clue. Every witness described him as calm, polite, and oddly reassuring. He never raised his voice, never acted impulsively, never lost control. In an era of hijackings often fueled by desperation, anger, or ideology, Cooper's professionalism stood out. He seemed rehearsed, as though he had played this part many times in his mind before walking onto that plane. Was this the mark of military discipline, or of a man who had simply shed every ounce of fear? And then there's the money itself. $200,000 in $20 bills, serial numbers recorded. A fortune heavy enough to drag a man down in a parachute harness, but small enough to vanish if hidden carefully. For years, none of those bills surfaced. Then, in 1980, nearly a decade later, a boy digging along the Columbia River unearthed a bundle of deteriorating 20s, identified by serial number, as part of Cooper's ransom. How did they end up there? Were they washed downstream by accident, planted as misdirection, or lost by a man stumbling through the wilderness? The bills only deepened the mystery, transforming a hard clue into yet another riddle. Each of these details, his alias, his cigarette brand, his tie, his demands, his eerie calm, forms a constellation of clues that suggest preparation, intelligence, and purpose. Yet none of them align into a single clear picture. Instead, they dance like reflections in water, visible but never graspable. Every lead is both something and nothing, both the answer and a dead end. The strange clues before and around the night of the hijacking form the foundation of the legend. They are the pieces investigators clutched at in desperation. The fragments amateur sleuths return to decade after decade, convinced that if they just align them differently, the ghost will take shape, but the ghost remains a ghost. And as the file turns its next page, the story moves into the storm itself, those critical hours of contradictions, missing evidence, and suspicious events that unfolded while Cooper was still aboard. The moment when the mystery thickened, when fact began to blur into folklore. Suspicion is a fog that clings to every corner of this case. Cooper often paints him as a flawless mastermind. The reality of the hijacking was riddled with oddities, moments that don't align, details that slip between fingers, and contradictions that feel almost deliberate. If the devil is in the details, then Cooper left a devil's playground behind him that night. Then there's the ransom delivery. FBI agents scrambled to assemble the $200,000, serial numbers carefully recorded, but the bills were not as crisp or uniform as Cooper might have expected. Witnesses said some looked worn, some freshly pressed, Why accept them without complaint? A desperate man might grab what he could, but a professional planning for years might reject anything less than perfect, knowing the FBI would trace him through every note. Cooper's calm acceptance of the mixed bills suggests either supreme confidence or a clue that he never intended to spend the money in the ordinary sense. Now consider the parachutes. Cooper requested 4, but the ones delivered were mismatched. 2 functional sport parachutes from a local skydiving school, and 2 older, outdated reserves. One reserve wasn't even operational, it was a dummy, used for classroom instruction. Cooper took one of the mains and one reserve, but here's the suspicious part. He chose the dummy reserve. Did he make a mistake? Did he fail to recognize faulty gear, or did he deliberately take it as misdirection, leaving the good reserve behind? If he jumped with a dummy backup, his odds of survival would have been slim, unless, of course, he never needed it in the first place. Start with the bomb. Every witness agreed. He opened his briefcase just enough to show red sticks, wires, and a battery. The threat was real enough to paralyze the crew into obedience, yet the bomb vanished with him. No debris, no trace, not even a clear memory of its make. Investigators later admitted they couldn't say if it was dynamite or a clever prop. Was it genuine, or was the whole thing theater? An illusion staged to give him power without ever risking the explosion. The suspicious part is how easily this central detail, the very weapon that made the hijacking possible, slipped away into nothingness. The flight path itself holds another layer of strangeness. Cooper ordered the crew to fly toward Mexico City at a low altitude and slow speed, but due to fuel limitations, they negotiated a refueling stop in Reno, Nevada. He agreed. That decision is odd. Why Reno? Why not force a refuel elsewhere, closer to the border, or at least a location of his choosing? Accepting Reno hints at flexibility, maybe too much flexibility for someone executing a tightly scripted plan. Did he know the terrain? Did he already have an extraction point mapped somewhere along that path? Or was he improvising, less meticulous than legend suggests? The most famous suspicious moment came at 8:13 p.m., when the cockpit registered a sudden pressure change, the sign of the rear stairwell lowering. That was the moment investigators believe Cooper jumped. But here's the thing. None of the chase planes shadowing the 727 saw him. Military jets tailed the flight at a distance, their eyes scanning the night sky. Not a single pilot reported seeing a figure fall. It's possible the storm clouds obscured him. It's possible they were simply too far back to catch the moment. But skeptics have long wondered, did he jump then, or did something else happen? Was the stairwell lowering part of a bluff, a signal, a trick? Could he have left the plane in a different way, earlier, later, or not at all? And then there's the tie. Cooper removed his black clip-on tie and left it on the seat before the jump. That in itself is suspicious. A man so careful, so deliberate, leaving behind the one personal item that might hold traces of his life. Modern forensic analysis decades later revealed metallic particles embedded in its fibers, suggestive of aerospace or industrial work. Was this an accident, a careless oversight, or a deliberate breadcrumb meant to mislead? Some believe the tie was planted as part of the performance, a false trail to send investigators in the wrong direction. The crew themselves gave testimony that raises questions. They described Cooper as calm, polite, and oddly reassuring. He never threatened the passengers directly, never harmed anyone, never raised his voice. In fact, some attendants said he was courteous, even gentlemanly, offering tips about turbulence, asking after their comfort, and carefully explaining his demands. This behavior doesn't fit the mold of a desperate criminal. It suggests someone playing a role, as though he were acting out a script. But whose script? His own fantasy, or someone else's design? Another suspicious wrinkle lies in his choice of attire. Cooper dressed like a businessman. Dark suit, white shirt, tie. Hardly ideal clothing for a parachute jump into freezing November woods. No boots, no heavy coat, no gloves. The temperatures at 10,000 feet were below freezing. The winds brutal. What man leaps into that storm dressed for the office? Was he reckless, suicidal, or supremely confident in awaiting pickup on the ground? The mismatch between his attire and his plan is one of the most haunting inconsistencies of the case. And then, of course, the silence after the jump. No parachute was ever found. No body, no gear, not even footprints in the supposed drop zone, despite exhaustive searches by military, police, and civilian volunteers. Search parties scoured the rugged forests of southern Washington. Dogs sniffed riverbanks. Helicopters combed ridgelines. Nothing. It was as if the storm had swallowed him whole. The suspicious part isn't just that he disappeared, it's how cleanly he disappeared. Most criminals leave a trace, even if it's just a broken branch or a scrap of fabric. Cooper left nothing. That level of vanishing act suggests either a tragic end in terrain too vast to recover, or a getaway so well orchestrated it erased every sign of his passage. The contradictions pile up. Was he a professional or a fool? Was the bomb real or theater? Did he survive the jump, or did he die in the wilderness? Each suspicious moment bends the story in a different direction. To some, the flaws suggest he perished in the storm, unprepared for the cold and weighed down by money. To others, the oddities point to a master plan, an extraction point, a partner on the ground, or a meticulous escape hidden in plain sight. The suspicious events during the hijacking don't bring clarity. They bring fog. Every detail becomes a double-edged clue, both evidence and distraction. A bomb that may or may not have been real. A parachute choice that may have been a blunder or a trick. A tie that may have been evidence or a decoy. A jump that may have been death or legend. And that's where the case pivots. The plane lands safely in Reno, the crew alive but shaken. The passengers, already gone, begin to hear the news in shock. And the FBI, standing by on the tarmac, realizes they are dealing with something unprecedented, a hijacker who has vanished into thin air, leaving only questions behind. When Flight 305 finally touched down in Reno in the early hours of November 25th, the night was heavy with silence. The stairway still hung open, creaking with each gust of wind, the hijacker long gone. Cooper's seat was empty, his bourbon glass drained, his Raleigh cigarette butts ground into the ashtray. All that remained was the tie, a ghost of its wearer. For the FBI, the case didn't end that night, it began. The next page of the file is where the chase begins. The aftermath, the investigation, the failures and the desperate search for answers. And as always, the trail that leads not to clarity, but to more shadows. The scale of the investigation was immediate, vast and unprecedented. More than 40 FBI agents were deployed within hours. The official file was stamped NORJAC, short for Northwest Hijacking, and it would grow into one of the most extensive case files in Bureau history. The search area stretched across thousands of square miles of Washington and Oregon wilderness, from the dense forests near Ariel to the icy waters of the Columbia River. Helicopters combed the terrain, planes flew grid patterns, military units joined the hunt. Volunteers tramped through mud and pine thickets, their boots sinking into ground that seemed to swallow evidence whole. Not a single definitive trace of Cooper was found. The search focused on the presumed drop zone, an area south of Mount St. Helens where the plane's path intersected with the timing of the stairway lowering. But weather conditions that night were brutal. Wind gusts over 200 miles per hour at altitude, freezing rain, darkness so complete that even trained paratroopers would hesitate. Many agents believed from the start that Cooper never survived the jump. They expected to find a body tangled in the trees, a parachute snagged on a ridge, or money scattered across a riverbank. They found nothing. The FBI released the recorded serial numbers of the ransom money, sending them to banks, casinos, racetracks, and businesses across the country. They hoped that if Cooper tried to spend even a single $20 bill, the net would close on him. Years passed, and the serial numbers turned up nowhere. The money seemed to have vanished as completely as the man who carried it into the storm. Back in Seattle and Portland, agents interviewed everyone. The crew, the passengers, airline staff, anyone who might have glimpsed Cooper in the airport. The composite sketch was drawn, a man with dark hair, sharp features, wearing sunglasses. But the sketch was only a ghost. No fingerprints lifted from the plane matched any records. The cigarette butts Cooper left behind were collected, but later, in a mishandling so severe, it still angers investigators. They were lost. The bourbon glass, too, yielded nothing useful. The tie sat in evidence, but for decades it was just another piece of clothing, its secrets unrecognized. The investigation quickly ballooned into one of the most expensive in Bureau history. Agents chased down every lid, no matter how outlandish. Paratroopers with criminal records were questioned. Former airline employees came under suspicion. Ex-military men were interrogated, their pasts pulled apart for any sign of connection. Dozens of suspects were floated, from petty criminals to decorated veterans. Each time the trail collapsed into dust. One of the earliest suspects was a man named Richard Floyd McCoy, who carried out a strikingly similar hijacking in 1972. McCoy hijacked a plane, demanded ransom, and parachuted out mid-flight. He was later caught and imprisoned. To many, the similarities were too close to ignore, but physical differences, along with strong evidence of McCoy's whereabouts during the Cooper hijacking, cleared him, though some conspiracy theorists still argue otherwise. Another suspect, Dwayne Webber, allegedly confessed on his deathbed in 1995 that he was D.B. Cooper. His widow recalled him having nightmares about a jump, and she claimed he once scribbled notes in a Bible under the alias Dan Cooper. Investigators tested his fingerprints against those recovered from the plane. No match. His DNA, compared against the tie decades later, offered no conclusive link. The case remained as empty as ever. Meanwhile, the public fascination became part of the investigation itself. Newspapers devoured the story, printing Cooper's sketch and stoking theories. Amateur sleuths organized their own searches, hiking into the Washington wilderness with maps, compasses, and optimism. None found more than mud and disappointment. The mystery became a cultural obsession, a story that refused to end. The only real physical evidence to ever surface came in 1980, when an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was digging along the banks of the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington. Buried in the sand, he unearthed a bundle of rotting $20 bills, still bound with rubber bands. When checked, the serial numbers matched the Cooper ransom. The find amounted to $5,800. It reignited the case, but offered no resolution. How had the bills ended up there? Were they dropped accidentally during the jump, or did Cooper, or someone else, deliberately bury them? Tests on the bills suggested they had been submerged for years, but the mystery of their location only widened the puzzle. There were others. Kenneth Christensen, a former Northwest employee, whose profile seemed to fit. William Gossett, a military man obsessed with Cooper lore. Even a man named Sheridan Peterson, a Boeing employee with skydiving experience. Each was investigated. Each was eventually dismissed. The FBI's frustration grew with every false lead. The legend of Cooper swelled, fed not by answers but by the yawning silence of failure. Yet for all the official dead ends, whispers of conspiracy lingered. Some investigators, even within the Bureau, suspected that Cooper may have had inside help. Someone who knew airline procedures. Someone who provided intelligence about the 727 stairwell. Someone who ensured the parachutes were delivered. Others believed he died that night, his body lost to rivers and forests, the money scattered beyond recovery, and still others insisted he lived, walking away into a new life under a new name, the ultimate escape artist. The aftermath of the Cooper hijacking left more than just unanswered questions. It changed aviation forever. Within months, airlines installed the Cooper vane, a device that prevented the rear stairway of 727S from being opened mid-flight. Security tightened across airports. Hijackings became harder, costlier, bloodier. Cooper had shown the world what was possible, and in doing so, forced the system to change. His crime was a blueprint as much as a legend. By the 1990s, the FBI had poured thousands of hours and millions of dollars into Norjack, and the trail was colder than ever. Each new test, each re-examined clue, brought less clarity and more doubt. In 2016, after 45 years of pursuit, the Bureau officially closed the case. The files were boxed, archived, and sealed, not because the mystery was solved, but because it was unsolvable with the evidence at hand. But the most haunting part of the aftermath is not the FBI's failure, nor the countless suspects who came and went. It's the silence. No ransom bills spent, no body recovered, no parachute found. Every piece of the puzzle that should have led to closure instead led to more fog. The investigation didn't collapse under the weight of lies. It dissolved under the weight of nothing. The next section of the file opens to the wild territory where facts falter and speculation thrives. The theories, the stories people tell themselves to fill the void. Cooper left behind. That silence still echoes in the file. Each report stamped, each witness questioned, each lid pursued into dead air. And when the FBI finally stepped back, admitting defeat, it left behind a ghost story dressed as a case file. A man in a suit, a bag of money, a leap into the night, and nothing else. But not everyone accepts that neat conclusion. Another theory suggests that Cooper not only survived but vanished by design. Supporters of this view point to his knowledge of the Boeing 727 stairwell, his precise demands about altitude and speed, and his unflappable demeanor. They argue that he was no amateur. Perhaps he was ex-military, an airborne ranger, a paratrooper, a Vietnam veteran, someone with the training and nerve to make the jump despite the odds. If so, The wilderness was not his grave, but his cover. He could have planned an extraction point, a road, or even an accomplice waiting in the dark with a getaway car. In this version, Cooper walked away into anonymity, the ransom hidden carefully, his life lived in silence under a new identity. The most common theory, favored by many within the FBI, is the simplest: Cooper died. He leapt from the 727 into the storm, carrying heavy ransom money strapped to his body, wearing only a business suit and slip-on shoes. The weather was brutal, the terrain unforgiving, the night moonless. Even skilled paratroopers balked at the conditions, warning that no one could survive a jump into freezing rain and high winds with poor equipment. Cooper, in this view, never made it out of the woods alive, his parachute tangled in treetops, or collapsed in a river. His body lies somewhere in southern Washington, claimed by the wilderness, hidden too deep to ever be found. The discovery of the $5,800 along the Columbia River only fuels this theory, money that spilled from a broken bag as his corpse sank into mud and water. For those who believe in this ending, the mystery isn't about how he got away, but how he never did. The files grow thick in this section, not with evidence, but with speculation. When a case produces no body, no smoking gun, no conclusive end, theories bloom like weeds. In the 50 years since D.B. Cooper vanished into the rain, the world has produced countless explanations, each one promising to pierce the fog. Some theories paint him as a tragic fool, others as a cunning mastermind. None have settled the case. Dwayne Webber's deathbed confession adds another strange thread. His widow recalled him murmuring about a jump, about hiding scars, about leaving fingerprints on a plane. He read books on the Cooper case obsessively, almost as if he were reading his own obituary in code. Investigators compared his DNA to samples lifted from Cooper's tie decades later, no match. Yet the confession lingers like a ghost story, haunting, unprovable, and impossible to shake. That leads to the conspiracy-minded theory: Cooper was not alone. Some argue that no single man could have pulled this off without help. Maybe he had someone inside the airline, feeding him details about the 727's design. Maybe someone on the ground, monitoring radio traffic, ready to pick him up once he landed. The absence of evidence, in this view, isn't proof of death, but proof of planning, a scheme so well executed that it erased its own tracks. Then there are the suspects turned theories. Richard Floyd McCoy, the man who hijacked a plane in almost identical fashion in 1972, remains a favorite among amateur sleuths. He parachuted with ransom money, survived, and was later caught. Some insist McCoy was Cooper, pulling off two versions of the same crime. The FBI dismissed this, pointing to differences in appearance and voice, as well as McCoy's solid alibi during the Cooper hijacking. But the similarities are eerie enough that his name refuses to leave the margins of the file. Another theory puts the focus on Kenneth Christensen, a former Northwest Orient employee who fit the general description and had both aviation knowledge and a quiet, mysterious life. A private investigator once named him the most likely suspect. The FBI disagreed, finding no hard evidence. But the theory continues to circle like a persistent fly, never quite swatted away. The theories are fueled by inconsistencies that refuse to resolve. Why did he request 4 parachutes? Why accept worn ransom bills? Why wear office clothes into a storm? Why leave behind the tie? Why demand a destination as far as Mexico City, but accept Reno as a refueling stop? Every detail becomes a springboard for another explanation, another narrative, another theory. Of course, the more outlandish theories have their place too. Some believe Cooper never jumped at all. According to this view, he staged the entire hijacking, lowered the stairway as a diversion, and remained hidden on the plane until after it landed. Then, slipping away in the confusion, he vanished into the Reno night as investigators swarmed the wrong places. Others suggest he was an intelligence agent testing airline security, a pawn in a covert operation whose identity was buried by design. A few even argue he escaped abroad, vanishing into South America with the ransom money, never to be heard from again. Even the small discovery of the $5,800 in 1980 becomes a mirror, reflecting whatever story the believer prefers. To those who think he died, the money is proof of his failure. To those who think he lived, the money was planted, a distraction, a way to make the world stop looking in the right place. What unites all the theories is the silence at their core. Cooper never resurfaced. He never spent the money. He never confessed. No fingerprints, no DNA, no trail. Every theory, no matter how convincing, is built on absence. and that absence is the heartbeat of the case. If Cooper died, he became a ghost, swallowed by the forest. If he lived, he became a ghost who walked among us. A man who ate breakfast the next morning while the FBI scoured mountains in vain. In either case, he was never caught, never confirmed, never closed. Theories rise and fall, suspects come and go, but the file remains unsolved, suspended in the fog between death and survival, accident and conspiracy, reality and myth. The next section of the file steps away from the investigators and theorists and into the hearts of those who carried the burden most heavily, the families and communities who never let go of the search, who kept the flame burning even as the trail grew colder with every year. Every unsolved mystery eventually slips from the hands of detectives and into the grip of the public. The Cooper case was no exception. When the FBI's search failed to find a body, a parachute, or even a scrap of clothing in the forests of Washington, the file became more than an investigation. It became a community obsession, a family legend, a ghost story told over kitchen tables and in small-town bars, whispered in the timber country, where people swore they saw parachutes drifting in the night sky. And that's what makes this case different. Most mysteries eventually collapse under the weight of evidence. This one only grows with time, fed by the hunger of those who need an ending that never came. Cooper may have been a man who jumped into a storm, but in the decades since, he has become something larger, an idea, a legend, a story that refuses to land. For the families of the suspects who came under suspicion, the search became a personal burden. Some carried shame, others defiance. Imagine being the son of a man accused of being Cooper, a father whose quiet life suddenly looked suspicious under the harsh spotlight of the Bureau. Some children defended their father's innocence to the end. Others admitted that they wondered, late at night, if the man at their dinner table might truly have been the hijacker who slipped through history's fingers. The case blurred the line between family and folklore, turning ordinary men into suspects in the greatest manhunt of their time. Communities in Washington and Oregon bore the brunt of the searches. Small towns near Ariel, Woodland, and the Columbia River watched as FBI agents tramped through their forests, knocking on doors, asking questions, probing into people's lives. Some locals joined in, eager to be part of history. Others resented the intrusion. But as years passed, those same communities embraced the legend. Annual gatherings sprang up in Ariel, where locals and enthusiasts would toast the mystery, share theories, and keep the story alive. It wasn't just an investigation anymore. It was folklore, a regional myth etched into the soil and rivers. The discovery of the $5,800 by 8-year-old Brian Ingram in 1980 reignited not just the investigation, but the imagination of the public. For the boy's family, it was a moment of bizarre fame. They became woven into the case's mythology, their names tied forever to the one piece of ransom money ever recovered. The bills themselves were analyzed, debated, dissected. Had they been washed downstream naturally, or deliberately buried as a red herring? For Brian and his family, the mystery became a strange inheritance, a story that bound them to a legend they had never asked to be part of. Families of suspects carried different scars. Dwayne Weber's widow spent years defending her belief that her husband was Cooper after his deathbed confession. She sought validation from investigators, pressed for answers, and lived under the weight of ridicule from skeptics. Kenneth Christian's relatives faced similar scrutiny, their lives interrupted by curious journalists and amateur detectives hungry for confirmation. For them, the search was not voluntary, it was imposed, a legacy they couldn't escape. For the amateur sleuths who dedicated their lives to the case, the search was less about closure and more about obsession. Some combed through FBI files released to the public, parsing every word for hidden meaning. Others hiked into the wilderness with metal detectors and maps, convinced they would be the one to stumble on the lost parachute or the rest of the ransom. A few spent fortunes chasing the ghost, sacrificing marriages, careers, even sanity. To them, Cooper was not just a mystery, he was a calling, and the wilderness, silent and unforgiving, seemed to laugh at them with every fruitless expedition. The crew of Flight 305 lived their own version of the search. For them, Cooper was not a legend, but a memory. Florence Schaffner and Tina Mucklow, the flight attendants who sat closest to him, were haunted by his calm voice and steady demeanor. They searched their own memories for clues, replaying his words, his gestures, the glimpse of the bomb in his briefcase. The pilots too replayed the night endlessly, wondering if they had missed some signal, some hidden detail that would have unraveled the truth. Their search was inward, private, a lifelong attempt to find closure in a case that offered none. And then there are the quiet searches, the ones that never make headlines, the hikers who scan riverbanks, the old veterans who compare their war buddies' stories to the details of the hijacking, the collectors who pore over $20 bills in the hope of finding one stamped with Cooper's serial numbers. Each is a small act of faith, a belief that somewhere out there lies the missing piece. Communities turned the mystery into ritual. In Ariel, Washington, the Cooper Day Festival became an annual event. Part wake, part carnival, part detective society. Locals gathered to drink, speculate, and toast the man who had both haunted and enchanted their region. People arrived in parachute costumes, reenacted the jump, and debated theories late into the night. It was folklore in action, the case reborn each year not in evidence, but in storytelling. The FBI may have closed the case, but the community never did. The strangest part is how the search itself became part of the legend. The absence of closure transformed ordinary people into detectives. It gave families a mystery to wrestle with, gave communities an annual ritual, gave amateur sleuths a lifelong obsession. Cooper's greatest trick may not have been the hijacking or the jump. It may have been the way he left the world searching for him forever. For the people touched by the case, the search was not just about finding a man, it was about answering something deeper. Can someone really vanish so completely? Can a person defy the system, the law, the wilderness itself, and walk away unseen? If Cooper could do it, then the world is stranger than we admit. And if he couldn't, if he died that night, then the search is not for a man, but for a ghost buried in the mud. And so, the case file moves toward its last page, not with answers, but with the silence that remains. For the final section is not a solution, but the closing of a door left ajar, the whisper of a mystery unresolved, echoing into eternity. The file is heavy with theories, testimonies, reports, but alongside those, there are photographs of families holding newspaper clippings, of communities gathering under grey skies to keep a myth alive, of searchers with metal detectors on forest trails. They are the human face of the search, the proof that a mystery can outlive the crime itself. The file ends the same way the night did, with nothing but silence. A man boarded a plane, ordered a drink, slipped a note to a flight attendant, and vanished into a storm. 50 years later, no body, no parachute, no confirmed trail. The story begins with precision and ends with emptiness. And that emptiness is what makes the Cooper case different from all the others that fill the drawers of unsolved crimes. Think about it. Most hijackers of the 1970s were caught within days, their plans collapsing under panic, poor planning, or the sheer weight of law enforcement bearing down. Cooper was different. He was calm, polite, even courteous. He didn't shout, didn't injure, didn't spill a drop of blood. He asked, he waited, he planned, and then he was gone. That absence of violence only sharpens the edges of his legend. He wasn't remembered as a monster, but as a ghost, a shadow in sunglasses, who bent the world for a few hours, and then stepped off it entirely. Investigators tried to box him in. They drew lines across maps, calculated wind speeds, charted parachute descent rates. They scoured rivers and mountainsides, searching for fabric, bones, or money. They interviewed hundreds of suspects, interrogated families, tested DNA. Every effort ended in fog. Every door led to another door. The case became a hall of mirrors, each reflection looking plausible, none leading to truth. That is the true haunting of the Cooper mystery. The silence is not passive, it is active, as if the case resists being solved. The more light you shine on it, the more the shadows rearrange themselves. Was he a seasoned paratrooper who lived, or a desperate man who died in the trees? Was he a loner, or part of a team? Did he vanish into a new life, or sink into a river, money and all? Every possibility is both true and false, suspended in the same storm where he jumped. Time, too, became an accomplice. Witnesses aged, memories blurred, evidence was lost or mishandled. Cigarette butts disappeared, fingerprints smudged, notes misplaced. What should have been solid fact dissolved into mist. Even the FBI, after decades of pursuit, eventually admitted defeat, closing the case in 2016. Not because it was solved, but because it refused to be. The Bureau, with all its resources and pride, had to concede that Cooper had beaten them, not in a gunfight, but in silence. And what of the ransom? $20 bills with their serial numbers recorded, scattered into history. Only one bundle ever surfaced, rotting in the sand by the Columbia River. Some say it proves he died, The money washed downstream as his body lay hidden nearby. Others insist it was planted, part of a clever misdirection. The bills are not a clue, they're a riddle. Like every other piece of evidence in this file, they refuse to resolve. And yet, the legend lives louder than ever. Each year, communities gather to toast the man who vanished into thin air. Sleuths pore over documents. Hunters comb forests. Journalists write new theories. Cooper has become something larger than a man. He is a myth etched into American folklore. A reminder that not every story ends with handcuffs and fingerprints. Some stories end with rain swallowing a parachute and silence filling the void. The most haunting question isn't whether Cooper lived or died. It's what he represents. If he died that night, then the world is crueler than we want to admit. A man gambled everything for a fortune and left nothing but a ghost in the trees. If he lived, then the world is stranger, that someone could outwit the FBI, vanish without a trace, and carry a secret to his grave. Either way, the case is not about a man in row 18. It's about the fact that even in a world of laws and order, someone can still slip through the cracks completely. So the file closes here, not with a resolution, but with an open door that leads nowhere. A man with no past, no future, and no confirmed fate. The tie, the cigarettes, the bourbon glass, the money in the sand, clues that circle back into themselves like a snake eating its tail. Somewhere in the forests of Washington, maybe a skeleton still lies tangled in branches, a parachute rotting into the soil. Or somewhere in America, maybe an old man once smiled quietly over a newspaper headline, sipping his coffee, knowing he was the ghost everyone was chasing. Either possibility is true, either possibility is false. The case lives in the space between, and that is why we reopen it here. Not to solve it, but to feel the weight of it. To sit with the silence, the uncertainty, the fog that refuses to clear. In the end, D.B. Cooper is not a man. He is a question, a riddle that haunts the skies long after the flight landed. The file shuts, the lamp flickers, and the shadows deepen. The man who jumped into thin air is still falling, even now.